Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving deep into one of the most overlooked yet critical economic realities shaping modern Russia, a condition economists call the Dutch disease. It's not a medical problem, but rather an economic one that can slowly weaken even the most resource-rich nations from within. Many experts argue that Russia, despite its vast oil, gas, and mineral wealth, is a textbook example of how this disease corrodes innovation, weakens institutions, and traps a nation in a cycle of dependency that's almost impossible to break. To understand what's happening, let's first define the concept. The term Dutch disease was coined in the 1970s when the Netherlands discovered massive natural gas reserves. At first, the new wealth looked like a blessing, but it caused the local currency to strengthen dramatically. As a result, other industries, manufacturing, agriculture, and technology, became less competitive internationally. The Dutch economy became overly reliant on one export sector, and when gas prices fell, the economy stumbled. What happened to the Netherlands, then, is what's unfolding in Russia now, only on a much larger and more dangerous scale. Russia's economy is built on oil and gas exports. For decades, this resource wealth has been the backbone of state power, funding government spending, military expansion, and foreign influence. But the more dependent Russia becomes on energy exports, the weaker its other sectors grow. When oil prices are high, Moscow feels invincible. When they crash, the entire system starts to tremble. And this cycle has been repeating for decades, creating a fragile economic structure with very little diversification. The symptoms of Dutch disease in Russia are everywhere. The ruble fluctuates wildly with global oil prices. Manufacturing and agriculture often struggle to compete on the global market because the energy-driven ruble makes Russian goods more expensive abroad. Innovation remains sluggish, and small businesses face heavy bureaucratic barriers. Meanwhile, vast amounts of capital are poured into the energy sector and military industries, sectors that don't necessarily create widespread prosperity or long-term stability for ordinary citizens. But the real issue isn't just economic, it's political. When a country's wealth is concentrated in natural resources, that wealth tends to concentrate political power as well. In Russia's case, the state controls or heavily influences the energy industry. This gives the Kremlin enormous leverage, but also fosters corruption, cronyism, and inefficiency. The elites who control the resource rents have little incentive to reform the system because they benefit from the status quo. The result is a kind of economic stagnation hidden beneath the illusion of strength. Let's look at how this plays out in everyday life. While Russia earns billions from oil and gas exports, much of that revenue doesn't trickle down to the average citizen. Infrastructure outside major cities is underdeveloped. Education and healthcare systems struggle with underfunding. And, in many rural areas, economic opportunities are limited, pushing younger generations to migrate toward Moscow or abroad. This urban concentration deepens inequality and leaves entire regions dependent on federal subsidies that come from, again, the energy sector. Another dangerous side effect of this economic model is vulnerability to global shocks. When Western sanctions hit after the invasion of Ukraine, the true cost of dependency on oil and gas became clear. Sanctions limited access to international financing and advanced technology. Yet because Russia's economic model is so tied to energy, there were few alternatives to fall back on. The state doubled down on its old habits, increasing control, suppressing dissent, and redirecting resources to sustain the war economy. Instead of reform, the system chose survival. Even when Russia tries to pivot, such as expanding trade with China, India, or the global South, the underlying issue remains. These partnerships still revolve around energy exports and raw materials. They don't solve the structural imbalance, they just shift the buyers. True economic modernization requires developing high-value industries like technology, renewable energy, and advanced manufacturing. But those sectors can't thrive in a system where the state dominates, corruption flourishes, and innovation is stifled by bureaucracy and fear. There's also a psychological dimension to this disease. When a country depends too heavily on natural resources, it often develops a sense of complacency. Why invest in innovation when oil and gas bring in easy money? Why reform institutions when energy profits can buy temporary stability? Over time, this mindset erodes ambition, efficiency, and adaptability. Russia's long-term competitiveness suffers because the system rewards loyalty and control, not creativity or entrepreneurship. What makes Russia's version of Dutch disease even more severe is how intertwined it is with geopolitical ambitions. The government uses energy as both a political weapon and a shield. It funds its foreign policy through gas pipelines and oil revenues, using them to maintain influence over Europe and its neighbors. But as global markets shift toward renewable energy and countries diversify their energy supplies, this leverage weakens. The future world economy will depend less on fossil fuels, and when that day comes, Russia could find itself facing an economic cliff. Experts warn that without diversification and reform, Russia's economy could stagnate for decades. The resource sector employs only a small portion of the population, so it doesn't generate enough jobs to sustain broad growth. Meanwhile, brain drain continues. Thousands of skilled professionals, scientists, and engineers have left the country in search of opportunities elsewhere. The very people who could help Russia modernize are being driven away by lack of freedom, low pay, and poor infrastructure. Some argue that Russia still has time to change course. If it invested heavily in education, research, green energy, and digital industries, it could build a more balanced economy. But that would require loosening state control, increasing transparency, and fostering competition. All things the current political structure resists. As long as political power and economic wealth remain concentrated in the hands of a few, the cycle of dependency will continue. What's most ironic is that Russia's immense natural wealth, which could have been a foundation for prosperity, has become a trap. The oil and gas that once empowered the nation now limit its growth. The government can suppress dissent, but it can't suppress global economic trends. The world is moving on, and Russia's over-reliance on fossil fuels risks leaving it isolated, both economically and technologically. The Dutch disease doesn't destroy a country overnight. It eats away slowly, weakening institutions, distorting incentives, and eroding resilience. Russia's challenge isn't about producing more oil or finding new buyers. It's about transforming an economic culture built on extraction into one built on innovation. That's a much harder battle, one that requires vision, reform, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. In the end, the story of Russia's Dutch disease is a warning to every resource-rich nation. Natural wealth can be a gift, but without balance and foresight, it becomes a curse. For Russia, the clock is ticking. The world is changing faster than ever, and unless it breaks free from this cycle of dependency, the very resources that once made it powerful may ultimately become the reason for its decline. And that's the reality behind Russia's Dutch disease, not an external enemy or a single crisis,